Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm Director for the Institute for Government. Welcome here for the final in the series of events on government and business, which we've done with the City Corporation, with the FT as media partner. It's been absolutely fascinating. The last one, some of you will remember because I recognise the faces, was with Paul Tucker, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, which was an excellent discussion of regulation. We've had earlier ones on the interchange between what's been happening in the private and public sectors, and we had one looking at the overall framework of development of industrial policy with Martin Donnelly, David Simon and Helen Alexander. Now, very much to round off, I couldn't think of anyone better to round off the discussion than John Browne, who has made a real impact on the workings of government in his period as lead non-executive director over the last nearly 3 years. Appropriately, the report of the NEDs is out. I recommend anyone reading it. One of the interesting things is people criticise big turnover amongst in Whitehall. But the one group where there's not very much turnover is actually on non-executive directors, which is far lower than ministers and civil servants. But John will refer to that. I'm particularly glad to welcome my, in genuine sense, very old friend, Lionel Barber. He and I worked together in Washington at the end of the Cold War. We saw the end of the Cold War and the transformation of that. And Lionel has made a tremendous success of being editor of the FT, which is now celebrating its 125th anniversary this year. And I say the FTs are our partner on that. Also in your seats, you'll see the report we did on financial leadership for government, which is part of the campaign. We don't normally campaign, but I think on this we do campaign on improving financial information, where we work very closely with John and the non-executive directors on this as a very important part of our work, and also with government too. And so you're welcome to see that. Now I'll just hand over to Lionel. This will be going, we'll go on to about 7:15, and welcome both John and Lionel.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it is a particular pleasure for me to be here, not just because of our long association going back to pre-Cold War days.
No, during Cold War, not pre-Cold War.
Well, you said I was 125 years old, so but there we are. So, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the City of London Corporation for its sponsorship of this important series of debates and discussions. We have, as Peter says, no better speaker than Lord Browne this evening. He needs no introduction. I've had the pleasure of reading his speech, which he kindly gave us an advanced copy under embargo, and it's an extremely thoughtful contribution. I'm then going to ask a few questions of Lord Browne. It will not be a trip to the dentist chair, but I hope we can have a good exchange, and then some questions from you, the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, Lionel, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's very good to be at the Institute for Government. I like this think tank enormously because, unlike so many think tanks, it does more than that. It actually speaks and people listen to what it says and actually do things about what it says, and that, I think, is exactly what the IFG is here for. It's a tremendous place indeed. So I'm very grateful indeed for the opportunity to speak here. In my role as government's lead non-executive board member, that's quite a mouthful, my top priority has been to transplant some of the lessons I've learned from the private sector into a public sector context. And that's not been a straightforward task. Governments have never been entirely sure of their proper role alongside the engine room of economic development. Over 2,000 years ago, China's best thinkers were summoned to court to debate the relationship between business and government. Legalist scholars lobbied for the nationalization of industry, defending it as a necessary intervention against apparently dangerous and obscene tycoons. On the other side, Confucians thought that the state was riddled with inefficiency and poor product quality. They made the Thatcherite case for privatization, though with rather less success than the Iron Lady. That debate has raged over the centuries since then, and we're not much closer to reaching a consensus. That's why the non-executives haven't been asked to run to government, turn it into a business. Rather, we've tried to make government more business-like and to help equip it with the new skills needed to deliver the intent of policy, whether that's privatisation, nationalisation, or something else. This point is important because it represents a lasting contribution that business can make to government. Both politics and business are rather ephemeral. Even the so-called great companies come and go, much to the embarrassment of the academics who've lauded them. But the skills to deliver government policy will always be needed. Government should look to the private sector, not to find out what to do, but to find out how best to get things done. In my opinion, that exchange of knowledge, experience and methods is the foundation of a productive and sustainable relationship between government and business. In 2011, I identified 5 themes to direct the work of the non-executives and their boards, and these were helping departments to operate with clarity about their strategy, instilling commercial sense into those who deal with the government's customers and suppliers, managing the talent within the civil service by providing people with a proper assessment of their achievements or failures and having in place an appropriate system of career development and incentives. Having relevant and clear management information which allows departments to track the delivery of strategic goals, and being more focused on obtaining results rather than just being content to have the right administrative processes in place and hoping that results will follow. Now, these 5 themes remain as valid today as they were 2 years ago. Many of them form the basis of the present attempts to reform the civil service. So tonight, I'd like to develop 3 of these themes: strategic clarity, a focus on results, and commercial sense. And then I'd like to say a little on learning and change. Let me begin with strategic clarity. In any organisation, in my experience, everything else is pointless if people aren't clear about the goal. Strategic clarity requires a combination of purpose and direction. A department's purpose is the output of the political process. It's certainly not for the civil service to decide on the policy on immigration or the goals of the Department of Transport. But to achieve that purpose, you need to set a clear direction. It's the task of officials to take a given government policy and to work closely with ministers to set the direction their department must take to get there. And you can't set direction without recognising the need to prioritise. People work best when they prioritise a small number of manageable goals. Now, I was recently sent papers for a government meeting which contained 7 agenda items, 11 so-called work streams, and 58 action points. And that was just for a subsection of one small government department. Now, that's not the best way to get the best out of your team. In business, 90% of a commercial strategy is about avoiding strategic ambiguity and deciding what not to do. Take Coca-Cola. It has a clear strategy: maintain a small number of quality brands and focus on building one of the world's best global distribution networks. That's it. By contrast, banks lost the plot because they tried to do too many things and too much, with no clear idea of the purpose that some of their activities served. Prioritising just a few things will result in a clear direction of travel, so that people know where they're heading, why they're heading there, and how they fit into the journey. Leaders need to reinforce that direction regularly. People need to hear it over and over again, so that the day-to-day urgent can't drive out the long-term important. Setting priorities is going to upset people, but it's the only way to achieve strategic clarity, the foundation of a successful organisation. My second point is about the drive to get results from policy, and not simply being happy that a process was in place to try. The social scientist Daniel Kahneman talks about two modes of thought. One produces slow, deliberative and logical thoughts, while the other is where faster, more instinctive and more emotional responses come from. You might call these the rational and the irrational, and they represent the two ways in which the private and public sectors are caricatured. Government is often criticised for making supposedly irrational decisions based on ideology or a single worldview, while business is presented as a paragon of rational, evidence-based analysis. In my experience, though, both the rational and the irrational are essential inputs in decision-making. The real challenge lies in exercising the judgment required to balance the two. The availability of computing power and so-called big data has made it easier than ever for a leader to consult the facts, so there's no excuse for uninformed responses. But decisions can't just be made through an appeal to evidence. Of course, you have to start with an objective analysis of the options available. But the analysis is just that, analysis. It's a mechanical process which must eventually lead to a subjective decision. Process can't replace decision-making and judgment. And that's why I'm a little suspicious of the term evidence-based policy making. Of course, policy must be based on rational argument made by the evidence. That's absolutely a necessary condition for good decision-making, but it's not a sufficient one. It must be accompanied by a willingness to exercise judgment. And the best leaders throughout history have shown an ability to do just that, and to balance the rational and the irrational. For people like Andrew Carnegie, Margaret Thatcher, Steve Jobs, the rational argument made by the evidence was just the beginning of a decision. To pursue their long-term vision, they also had to do what seemed like the irrational. Carnegie, for example, the subject of a book I've recently written, a little piece of a book, would take a contract, whatever the profit margin. And when demand slowed, he would increase rather than decrease the output of his steel mills. When Margaret Thatcher decided to defend the Falkland Islands from invasion, I doubt she conducted a cost-benefit analysis. Instead, she acted on a view about Britain's place in the world. And Apple certainly listens to its customers, but I don't think Steve Jobs ever released a product which was the lowest common denominator from a focus group. In government, many decisions run into difficulties because they lack a high quality and objective appraisal of the options available, as well as a willingness to exercise judgment when the time comes. Take the government's major project portfolio. The non-executive directors have found that projects are too often begun without enough analysis to suggest that they will be successful, and without rigorous plans for what to do if things go wrong. But getting that right is just the start, because decisions don't just make themselves. When it comes to the expansion of London's airports, for example, the answer cannot come just from weighing up the pros, cons and risks of different sites. It'll be the outcome of a subjective, emotional and perhaps irrational argument about vision and purpose, informed all the while by objective analysis. A leader's job is to balance the two to come to a decision. And I've often been asked, what's the secret to making great decisions? My answer usually is, I don't know, but if pushed, I say a simple thing. Conduct great meetings in which you have the relevant people around the table, all of whom have an equal voice. Get the rational done first, and then test the irrational. Let me now change tack and talk about the need for commercial sense. During my time advising many UK governments, I've been struck by the intelligence, professionalism and loyalty of the civil servants I've met and worked with. But there are certain things the civil service is now asked to do which require new skills. One is the leadership of projects. I estimate that around $20 billion a year goes into what's called major projects, and probably double that amount goes into minor ones. Over the past decade, world-class corporations have improved the efficiency of this spend by at least 20%. If the public sector could match even half that improvement, the savings would be very, very significant. As a result of a strong push from the non-executive board members, the Major Projects Leadership Academy was set up to provide civil servants with the commercial sense needed to lead on a level playing field with their private counterparts. And I use the word lead because it would take years to build sufficient capacity in the civil service to run the whole portfolio of major projects to the highest standards. And in any case, the Academy was not designed as a substitute for years of experience in project management or procurement. That means that these types of people will need to be brought in from outside. That's usually where world-class players in these areas are to be found. After all, why would they want to work in government and not in Boeing, just to use some Bs, Boeing, BG or BP? The good news is that they can be brought in temporarily to join a project team, which by its very nature is a temporary organisation designed for delivery. Major projects do best when they employ outside experts where needed and where there is a degree of separation between the delivery team and the political process. That was the model employed for the Olympic Games, which are now rightly lauded as an example of excellent project leadership and management. Outside expertise comes at a price, though, and people need to be paid accordingly. But as soon as someone working in government is seen to be earning more than the Prime Minister, we criticise and vilify them. In doing so, we demonstrate a failure to understand incentives and the market for commercial skills. Incentives are the key to unlocking change. We should recognise this and use them to improve the performance of government. Denying a role for incentives will do exactly the opposite. The final thing I'd like to talk about this evening could perhaps be the single biggest obstacle to progress in government. It's the question of organisational learning, in particular from experiences of failure. Stories of success clearly inspire people as they highlight examples of excellence which should be emulated. But people have a limited capacity for propaganda which turns everything into some sort of achievement, as when people say that not that something went badly, but that it went less well than they had hoped. In my experience, stories of failure are far more important. They keep you realistic about the challenges you face and stop you from losing touch with the reality on the ground. Most importantly, they're the only powerful mechanism for learning. At BP, when I was about to give my first speech to our newly formed Russian company, one of my Russian business partners pulled me to one side, probably to destabilize me, but pulled me to one side and said, "I suggest you remember that after 70 Soviet years, these people, i.e. the audience, can smell propaganda. I suggest you only talk about human failures and not about glorious successes." I think we've yet to learn that lesson in government. An obsession with successes is not necessarily, not actually, the fault of individuals. It's the result of an organisation's induced behaviour. To tell stories of failure, you need to record them. But why would a responsible civil servant want to do that? The only consequence would be discovery through a freedom of information request, followed by a hue and cry to search for those to blame. The Major Projects Authority recently published its assessment of the government's major projects, and not all of them were good. That sort of transparency is very encouraging, but it's only the beginning. Failure is still frowned upon rather than seen as the inevitable and desirable consequence of informed risk-taking. And I believe this needs to change, because failure goes hand in hand with excellence. Perhaps if disclosure and discussion were more common, then Parliament and the press might start to judge failure in its proper context. Ladies and gentlemen, those are 4 observations from my time in government about strategic clarity, results, commercial sense and learning. The non-executive board members are part of a wider set of instruments designed to tackle the problems I've described, and as my second annual report shows, we're making progress in some areas. But there's only so much that independent directors and a reform plan can do. They can make valuable and long-lasting changes within existing structures. But our system of public administration faces deeper existential questions. We now expect the state to deliver more from a declining resource base and with a staff which is being asked to do things they are not necessarily trained to do. Sometimes I feel we expect the civil service to do anything that's asked of it without the right behaviour or culture that comes from the appropriate incentives, pay, training, or overall structure in which to perform. Our model of governance was built for the 19th century, when government was small and uncomplicated, and today the roles and duties of the permanent civil service and wider public service need rethinking and realigning with a political system that has moved on considerably from the time of Northcote Trevelyan. The whole nature of departments needs to be reconsidered. Unproductive frictional costs arise as one silo rubs against another. The leadership of corporate functions like finance, IT and procurement needs to be defined and given clear direction. And we need to future-proof the civil service by maintaining a clear strategic vision of its capacity and capability. That would allow the government to cut the cost of departments without reducing their effectiveness. My friend and former colleague Nick Butler summed it up rather well when he wrote in the Financial Times, where else of course, that Whitehall is failing not because civil servants are lazy or incompetent, but because in the current outdated structure, no one could succeed anyway. It's time to learn from experience and look more fundamentally at how we expect the civil service to behave and perform in the 21st century. A comprehensive and independent review of the civil service's structures, processes, and lines of accountability is long overdue. So too is a thorough review of the roles and responsibilities of ministers and Parliament when it comes to their relationship with the civil service. The chairman of the Public Administration Select Committee has, for example, called for a royal commission, which would be the first independent examination of the civil service and our whole system of governance since the Fulton Commission of 1968. If the result were a more effective, flexible and sustainable civil service fit for the modern world, then it would be time well spent. If it were just a report for the archive, it would be incredibly damaging. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. There are so many interesting and startling insights, if I may say, in that brief lecture that you've given, such as the need to embrace failure, the notions, the important notion of incentives and related pay to guarantee success, and also your very important point about us still working with a model of 19th century governance. But before I explore some of these themes, I'd just like to ask you a practical question. You've worked for 40 years and more with the government, but for the last 2 years, you've paid regular visits to the heart of the beast. So tell us, what did you find most surprising?
I've worked with lots of governments, as you know, all over the world in one way or another, mostly trying to persuade them to allow BP or other companies to do business with them, and sometimes with great difficulty too. But I think what I've learned is the following. First, I really don't think that the people employed by the civil service are actually malign. And I think that's quite important, because sometimes they're caricatured as malign, and they're not. They may be asked to do things that they actually, they may not understand them, and they may not be trained to do them. And so that's really, I think, my first thing. My second point is that I've realized that all government is a bit messy, but when I step back and look at corporate activity, it is messy too. It's just that corporations have more time to package it nicely. But actually, the world moves very quickly in business, as you know, and if you stand still and say, I have a fixed plan and I intend to execute it, then indeed you will be, your lunch will be eaten by somebody else. And so I don't find too much difference between the flexibility needed in government and the flexibility needed in almost any pastime at all nowadays. So I find that. I must say I do find, though, that government is very sensitive to the press.
Too sensitive,
I
aren't they?
think so. They are. I mean,
Any particular member of the press?
No, I'm not saying that, but I think they are. I just think it may be this may not be true, but I think with Bernard Ingham, Mrs. Thatcher used to have the press summarised, and she got a sort of perspective, maybe Bernard Ingham's perspective. I think John Major read it all himself and started the day pretty depressed, I think one has to take the rough with the smooth if you're there. I just have a sense that people are very sensitive to it.
And overall, if you look at the civil servants that you've encountered over the last 2 years, compared to, say, the civil service class of 20 years ago, do you believe that the quality is lower, higher, or roughly the same?
I think the big difference is that the civil service of the past projected so much confidence that you couldn't tell how good they were. And I think the civil service of today projects very little confidence, and so you can see its weaknesses more. And
why is that, John?
I don't know. I think partly it's probably training. I mean, people, I think, are more... they're slightly more self-aware. I mean, in today's terms, most people who are in any structure sort of have figured out that, things aren't all right the whole time. Whereas I think 20, 30 years ago, perhaps there was less information, and you said, I'm in charge of the world. That's what I do,
So we've lost that sense of effortless superiority.
Effortless superiority, and, I always, you've heard me tell the story, I really do believe that actually power comes from hiding away how much work you do, never show that you're busy, never show that you're tired, and always have time to talk to people, and most importantly, always maintain capacity for the unexpected. And I think people's work habits today people are pushed to actually behave differently, and they shouldn't. They should behave as if nothing really is happening. We need swans, lots of activity under the water, not too much on top.
Or as my colleague Philip Stevens once remarked, quoting a senior Treasury civil servant, the ability to perform a perfect U-turn while carrying on effortlessly in the same direction.
Yes, I think that's broadly right, but I
Definition
do think...
of success at the Treasury.
I must say, I think that today, with much more information around, those sorts of skills aren't actually needed. What are really needed are some of the skills, some of the transplanted skills from business, plus and great interpersonal skills to deal with Parliament, the civil service and so forth, in a way where you understand the emotions involved. I mean, I think that's...
John, let's go back to what you were saying about the 19th century Northcote Trevelyan model of governance in Britain. Tell us, what were the principles of governance at that time and how it's changed?
Of course, it's the separation entirely of the politics and the administration. But I think more interestingly, it seemed to me that at that time, we as a very rich nation could afford to have government made of many parts. And that was very necessary. Of course, communications weren't as good as they are today, and actions were much more slow. And so you built departments that were self-contained. The administration was self-contained. The ministers changed the whole time. It stayed. It executed what were slowly changing policies, probably quite slowly changing. And they were all quite separate. And today, the question we have to ask, I think perhaps like in the corporate sector, is can you actually afford that? Can you afford a federated system of administration? Or do you want something, or as in the corporate side we found, that federated systems really don't work, they're too expensive and they're too slow, and they deny you the ability to have the best of the best doing things that you need, because you can't proliferate skill. So you have to sort of build an integrated whole together, not federated, but pulled together. And I think that's, in my mind, a question that should be thought through.
You mentioned the importance of modern technology and instant communications, but this model of governance has also arguably been fatefully undermined by the rising role of special advisors, has it not?
The answer is I don't know. I just don't know. I don't see enough close in of what the special advisors do to be able to say it undermines or not. But I think you should never have a system, well, in my corporate experience, you should never ever have people who have power and no accountability. That is really bad. I mean, many of my former colleagues from my age, a great man who used to run a great Spanish company I know very well, said, his ultimate ambition in life is to escape all responsibility and have total power. And that's what he intended to do during his retirement. But I think having people who are not accountable, who have power, is very dangerous in any organisation.
But you do believe that special advisors have become more influential over the years since they were introduced in the early 70s?
Yes, definitely. But I can't tell exactly how, I'd say. For that, you have to ask a minister.
An excellent segue. What makes an effective minister in contemporary Britain?
Well, I can only answer one aspect of that, because it seems to me that the one role which is very important is to try and identify, along with colleagues, what are the few things that need to be done, the few. And also to self-discipline, to think about what does need to change and what doesn't need to change. And I fully understand party policies and things like that. But again, in my experience in corporations, when leaders change, very often leaders say, my predecessor was mad, and so I'm going to change everything, just for the purpose of making change. And that's very dangerous. But there are certain things that can be changed, and picking the few rather than a lot is, I think, immensely powerful. It's an immensely powerful leadership act if you can discipline yourself to do that.
Is it true, or just a cliche, that the best ministers often have had some business or exposure to the commercial sector?
I can't tell, and so few have nowadays. So few have actually had a real exposure in the commercial sector. That's to say, had a job with accountability for people and policy and strategy and performance. Very few have had that. I think it would certainly help. It clearly does help, because you can see the important thing, I think, in business is you actually see the link between the input and the output. And you understand that, you know, by varying something by £2, you may or may not get -2 or +6, and you understand the linkages. And that's something which all business people do. I mean, they really understand the linkage between resources and outputs very well.
John, you made some startling claims about potential cost savings on project management. You mentioned that currently the government has more than 190 major projects, combined whole life cost of more than £350 billion, and you believe that there could be significant cost savings. What would be the essential steps to be taken by the government?
Well, it's what I think we're trying to do with the Leadership Academy. Most importantly, it is to plan up front. You know, I wrote a report for the government called Getting a Grip, which was about major project leadership and management. And it's very clear from all experience that the projects have to be planned very, very carefully up front. 90% of all decisions are made before anything actually happens on the ground. And actually, one of my cynical former colleagues would say the high point of any project is the moment before you start it. Because you should have understood exactly what it's like at that point. So I think that it's planning up front makes a very big difference, and building the right commercial relationships with all the people. But most importantly, part of the planning up front is the picking of the right team, making sure that they're incentivized in the right way, and building all that up front. You don't sort of do a project and say, well, I wonder who we should have to run it. Because at that moment it's too late. We should start with the people, start with the incentives, start with the idea, then plan it well. And actually magic happens at that point, it really does. It's quite surprising how the right choices start being made, how people think about what happens if things go wrong, and how they organize themselves for success.
And what advice would you give to the talented outsider that you referred to in your lecture on several occasions that could make a difference, apart from negotiating the right terms for the job?
Well, I think they need to do that, but they can come in and do something which they probably can't do in most commercial organisations for a period. I think they shouldn't come in forever, but they can actually effect things that will make a difference actually to people's lives and to the country. And while, you know, I think, Browne, if you and I were sitting in America talking like this, we would understand that completely.
Yeah.
The problem here is we don't fully understand that. But this is actually about something that can really make a difference to the nation as a whole, in its own little way. And I think that's important to a lot of people.
And are there any changes that you believe you need to make in terms of civil service rules or disclosure, or in order to create greater movement between the private sector and the civil service? Because you're clearly suggesting that that should be the case.
Well, I mean, it's been talked about again and again. We should just try it. We should just do it and see what barriers are there. And some of it's happening. I do think that we need to open up the system and say, yes, we're going to get people in temporarily, and we're going to pay them 3 times the Prime Minister's current cash compensation, because they're going to make a huge difference to us, and they're going to be with us for 3 to 4 years, and then they're going to go.
And we won't care what that particular tabloid newspaper would...
No, we won't, say. Because we know we should have the confidence to say it's going to make a very big difference.
Yes.
And that's what's important. And we should stick to what we believe, I think.
Let me just close before opening questions to the audience. Obviously, John, it is the case that that budgets are going to be constrained, and that the role of the state is inevitably changing because of limited resources. So, if you had to imagine the British state, just if you had your magic wand, and we had a very effective Royal Commission which produced its work without lots of QCs at minimum cost, produced recommendations which were implemented, by 2022, say, 2020, what would the state look like? What would Whitehall look like?
So I'm going to answer my first hypothetical question.
Yes.
Ever.
Yes, well, you know me very well. I won't tell anyone.
I think my experience would say it's likely to be this, but I may be entirely wrong, of course. It's going to be an integrated civil service where you won't actually see departments in the centre as a whole. They will be added on to the sides, and people will be able to dip in and out of a central core of activity. And actually that core of activity will be world class. It will be smaller. It will be able to adapt to the role of the state, which will move because it's designed to be just that flexible. So when you need more time on defence, you can have more people doing that, less time on home, or whatever you call these departments. But I think I'd like to see that sort of access to a central core, and I don't mean a corporate centre, I mean some sort of organisation that we can probably invent something new with satellites around it. And I think, I say in my experience, is because this is the sort of way that a lot of corporations think of themselves today. When it started, when this idea started, a lot of very senior people said, oh, you mean we're in a cloud? You know, we just float above it. And the answer was, no, actually, we're rethinking accountability and how you can execute very differently. Nowadays, I think people don't think it like that, but actually most people operate in that sort of structure. And people have realized that their power, if anything, is expanded because they get better help.
And the Cabinet Office sits where in this particular...
I have no idea.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I think that's all, if I may, details.
Yes, exactly. Please open Peter, and then...
Thank you very much indeed, John and Lionel, for both John, your speech and Lionel's questioning. Can I take up on the last point, to the obstacles? I mean, if you look back at the history of reform, departmental pressures have always frustrated drives from the centre. How do you get the politicians into that? Because you have a number of ministers, we heard at an event we had yesterday, lost the number of ministers because of patronage. Prime ministers want to keep their majorities, MPs satisfied by them having ministerial jobs. You have to have quite a revolution in relations between the politicians as ministers and Parliament in the structure you describe of integrated civil service. If you're going to have the accountability, I mean, you've got to change the accountability framework.
I think you have to change it to an extent. First of all, let me say that whatever happens, I have a belief in reform, that before you embark on almost anything, you should spend a lot of time trying to find out what it is that's good for everybody. You've got to find, by discussion, where the rationale is. You know, why should I bother doing this? And I think that takes years sometimes, and it may take a couple of goes at getting it right. But it seems to me that if you can still keep plenty of room for patronage, as long as you're clear about how you align the, what you might call the governance accountabilities with the management accountabilities. It doesn't limit the number of people involved in that, it is just the way you link. So again, in my direct experience, how do you link board accountability to shareholders and management accountability to board? They're very different, but they have to be linked. You can't have the board floating off somewhere, and you can't have the shareholders floating off somewhere, or management saying, you know, we'll get back to you when we figure it's right. They have to be linked. So you can do that, and you can expand or contract the number of people in the governance, the ministerial ranks, if you will, up and down according to, frankly, political need. Again, I think you can do that. You know, corporations do that. I mean, they do it to do with retaining people, development, a whole variety of things like that. Simple patronage.
Gentleman in the side there, yeah. Yes, yes, and then...
Yeah, I'd like to hear a bit more about accountability. And you mentioned Coca-Cola at the beginning and said it had a simple strategy. And then you mentioned some examples just then. If you take local government and take Camden Council, I was a councillor there once, has 500 services, each of them with its own levels of accountability, some statutory, legal basis, etc. And all of them, there's a whole democratic basis underneath that. And a load of those departments and services are delivering from government or government directives as well. And so how do you see that very large, complex provision of services and etc. with an accountability that doesn't really resemble the simplicity of, say, a Coca-Cola model, which is, as you said, selling one or two products, or, as you've said, just a shareholder relationship? I mean, in the democratic model, there seems to be sort of many types of shareholders and many types of levels of accountability.
Yeah, as indeed there are in some corporations which are multi-product. So Hitachi or 3M, for example, would be, I mean, there would be broad analogies. So as long as there's clear accountability, clear linkage between the political and the execution level, the key is the accountability. And then how you divide that up is a matter of, frankly, cost, efficiency and taste. So my answer to you is yes, absolutely, but you have to look at it and ask yourself, you know, what can you afford to do? That's the question.
Gentlemen, just that name.
That makes sense?
I'll stand up just so you can see me. You slightly depressed me on a sunny day with your obsession with how much we have to pay people, good people, to come into government to contribute. You mentioned several times we had to pay people above the sort of glass ceiling which we're trying to implement of the Prime Minister's salary. I look at what the people in the ODA were paid to deliver the Olympics, and I think it's scandalous. And surely, they would have been happy to do that, just to have the pride in delivering something like that for a more reasonable and modest salary, not for their entire careers, but just to take 3, 4, 5 years out to give something back to society and not feel you have to be paid the same as you're paid in a money-grabbing organisation in the private sector.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, money is not the entire incentive. But what I wouldn't like to do is simply to invite people from the outside world to come into the civil service because they have so much net worth that they can afford to, quote, take a few years' time out of being paid. Then I think you've got a very interesting selection problem. You're only then picking people who've already made it. And I'm not sure that's what you want. You want people of all backgrounds to come, people, who actually are used to earning money and their family therefore is used to spending it, and those who are actually quite different and they are quite happy to have nothing. And with the greatest respect, I do not think that business can be characterised as money grabbing. It just proves, I think, my point, perhaps about China, 200 years before the Christian era, we're still there.
Yeah, I think money grabbing is profitable. Virginia.
Profuse apologies for not being here at the start, but it's completely my favourite subject, so you've probably answered all my points. But my sense is that the problem with politicians is getting worse and worse, because when they used to be part of a trade union or part of the army or part of any corporate entity, they knew that you had to work as an organisation. And increasingly, politicians are one-man bands. They've only ever employed their secretary, and they don't do that very well either. And they all get taught, they've got to train to have a close encounter with John Humphreys, Jeremy Paxman, or maybe even Peter Riddle or Lana. But nobody tells them anything about management. And there are various very key principles. If every time it goes wrong, officials get a kicking, when every time it goes right, ministers take the glory, nobody will work in that context. And one of the reasons people are reluctant to come into the public space is they're terrified if there's a problem, there'll be a sort of blame culture. Secondly, politicians still think that the press notice delivers it. And everything you said about careful preparation in advance is right, but it's very hard when you then have to have legislation. And the minute something's announced, that is the whistleblowing for all the protests or forces of evil to come out against it. Whereas in business, you know, you're going to shut a plant, you've got the whole thing fixed, and you've got the guy a nice job next, and so I'm not saying it's easy, because I think it's very difficult indeed. And the real problem is about expectations. In business, if you overpromise and underdeliver, you're slaughtered. But in the public sector, you are always overpromising and underdelivering, and nothing makes people more maddened, actually, in the health service or in the social security or in the prisons, than to have ministers saying it's all wonderful, there's lots of money, it's all so easy. They're having a hard time. It means that the leaders are not authentic. It means that there's terrible disappointment in what happens. Now, I am so welcome the fact that you've given such effort to your work, because what there has to be is a kind of reality check from leaders who've actually been through large-scale organisations achieving change. And my change of career was all about finding the people who'd wear the tin hat and come in and actually take on these tasks. So it's not really a question, but,
No, but
it was a paean of praise.
If I may say, it was a statement with which I agree. So,
The gentleman in the second, I've been promised. Then,
Thank
yes,
you.
at the back.
I'd like to pick up Lord Browne's point about the need for government to deliver a great deal more with fewer resources in future. I just completed a 15-month study for the Departments for Education and Health, produced a report at the end of it called Age of Opportunity, which I believe actually offers a paradigm shift in government spending, which could deliver exactly what you're saying. But there are two great snags in it, or in the delivery of it. One is that government thinks, I've had wonderful feedback from ministers on this, but they all look at what they can deliver before the next election. Their entire focus is on what can be delivered by 2015. Whereas what is required to succeed with this is longer term investment, longer term thinking. And secondly, what's required is to recognize that you need to spend money in some departments to achieve savings in other departments. But as the excellent report from the Institute for Government demonstrates, that's not what the Treasury does and not what we are achieving with current government. Now, before I came into doing this work with government, I worked in industry. I spent 17...
Could you ask the question?
Yeah, sorry. So, well, in industry, my experience was you've got a profit motive. With the profit motive, you can drive long-term thinking. You can reconcile differences between different departments. How do we, in government, create that integrated principle that would allow opportunities such as this to be followed up?
well, I think the only answer, first of all, it sounds terrific. I think that nothing changes without a reason. So if there is actual pressure on the availability of people and money, then things will change. They won't change necessarily immediately, but if we have tons of money to go around, then we'll do things any way we want. But as the amount of resources declines, generally things become more efficient. And that's what I think is happening now.
Bernard Jenkins.
Bernard Jenkins, thank you very much indeed for your remarks and indeed for your endorsement of the idea of an independent commission. I thoroughly endorse what you said about salaries, incidentally. I don't see how the government can address skills shortages in, say, project management if every time they second a civil servant to the private sector they never come back because their wife won't let them, if I may put it that way. I know, I realise that was a mistake. My apologies. But
It's a serious mistake.
the Francis, it was a mistake, I apologise. Francis seems to be embarking on an increasing number of radical changes which involve substantially increased ministerial patronage in ministerial private offices and at the top of departments. Do you think this is based on any kind of shared analysis of why running a government department is such a frustrating and tortuously difficult business, or has become so, or why things seem to be going wrong in government agencies? Or is this, I mean, I hesitate to use what Peter Hennessy described the civil service reform plan as. He described it as a hissy fit.
And I think we need to understand there is enormous frustration, but is this frustration actually going to be addressed by the kind of changes that are being talked about at the moment?
Well, Bernard, I don't know. And I think, first of all, I'd say that I know there's been a lot of talk about lots of political appointments here and there, but actually when you look at the appointments, I can't see many of them being of that character. There's quite a lot of process which takes place to make these appointments. So I think the rhetoric and the reality may be a little out of kilter here. So I'd make that first point. Secondly, there is no doubt that there's enormous pressure on the government. It's called cutting out resources. And it's not just cost, it's all resources have to somehow shrink. And it looks like the plan and program for doing that is much longer term than anyone thought. So it's hardly surprising that people are getting a little short-tempered, actually. I mean, they do in business as well, when you start having to squeeze down and every day you come in and say, it's a great day in the office, I've cut costs again. You know, it's not that much fun, actually. I mean, it's great fun to say, I've come into the office and I've built another great business or something. So I think the language needs to change because the pressures are quite great. And I think everyone needs to recognise that I think people are working very hard. Come back to the question, and I think, it would be counterproductive to, when one starts a set of actions, they have to somehow they can't just be stopped, they have to be managed. And I think that's where we are at the moment. And let's see how that works out. I think it's a, if you will, it's a selective menu of things which are being done. And maybe not all that needs to be done in the easiest way.
And John, in your years at BP, you obviously presided over a period of dramatic change. You built a world-class, world-sized oil company. It would be fair to say that you didn't necessarily employ the kind of rhetoric that we've heard over the last 2 years to instigate and carry out that change?
No, although I think the change had tons of defects in it and wasn't finished. And big thing about change is, I'm afraid, it's a bit like, Heineken. You really have to go to all the parts to make sure it's working. That didn't work completely in BP. And I think, it's just because we hadn't thought it through properly in that aspect. But to me, the most important thing was trying to figure out how to get people on, as they say, the same page. Yeah. What's in it for everybody. And I'm not talking about venal, what's in it is another $55. It's what's in it in terms of their aspiration and for the shape of the enterprise and their belief in it. That's very important. And that's the biggest part of change, is getting the context, getting people motivated to do the change themselves, because you can't drag people to it.
I'm going to take a couple of questions there and then the gentleman there. Can you take 2 questions, please, but please make them brief.
A really quick one. Going back to the question of pay, what is your take on the idea of putting a small levy on suppliers with the direct money going to paying the higher rates of pay for the specialists coming into departments? So the answer to the newspapers would be that businesses are paying for these people. And the second thing would, businesses would probably get better outcomes because there would be better management inside the public sector. Well,
I never answer a question about quote, a good idea until I've thought through the implications.
How about you think it through?
And I think there's, be careful about messing around too much with the market. I know markets fail, but human ideas and government diktats fail even more frequently. So I think that be careful with it. I think, in the end, you can't hide things. You just need to say, look, it has a clear benefit. And I think a more straightforward argumentation of what is needed is, in the long run, a healthier thing to do.
Let's take the gentleman there. And and then you get it. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Clive Bates. I left the civil service a few months ago, but I want to speak up in favour of it, because I think there's something in your narrative that is a little bit too broad-brushed about failure. And, you know, that quote from Nick Butler, for example, you know, no one could succeed. Well, actually, there's an awful lot of success does happen. You know, services are delivered, incredibly challenging reform agenda in welfare, in health, in education, criminal justice system, so it's all going on, all being done by, you know, professional individuals doing their job. So I think one of the reasons to have an independent commission is to get a higher resolution view of what the problem actually is, where the failures are. And they are probably in those areas that you've been focusing on, to do with large-scale project management, IT-driven change, some of the expectations that are over-ambitious, perhaps set by ministers in terms of how quickly you can change a society and all of that. That, I think, would be really helpful. And I just want to follow up with a question on that observation, which is, do you actually think there is more failure in government than there is in the private sector? A lot of failure in the private sector. It just cleans it out very quickly with the processes of creative destruction, takeovers, companies go bust, product lines stop, people are sacked, and so on. And is the secret here for us to be just better and more efficient at dealing with failure, more ruthless in a way at dealing with failure?
Actually, I think you've made my point, because it's exactly that. It's what I put under the heading of organisational learning. I mean, there's tons of failure. The question is, what do you do with it? What do you do with it? Do you perpetuate it? Do you clean it out? Do you learn from it? What do you do? How quickly can you admit it? So when something's bad, you say it's bad. It's not actually not quite good. It's bad, you know, and then get on and do something. So I'm 100% with you. And please do not misconstrue my use of Nick Butler's quote. I used Nick Butler's quote because Nick Butler wrote it.
And we published it,
and he published it, and the FT is part of this, and I had to get one reference to the FT in. So you know, otherwise, you know, I'm never invited back. So I think that, you know, the civil service does extraordinary, and the public service, which delivers a lot, does a job under very trying circumstances. The real question is, can you actually do it better with less? And I mean, you know, as the shape of government changes, what can you do there? And I think it's combining the present day delivery with the change that is, I think, the big challenge. And that was what I was talking about.
Gentlemen,
so I'm with you on
and
your
then
point.
How would a well-managed business seek to cut costs, and how does that compare with a spending review process?
Well, there are some elements. I mean, the first thing it always looks at is, you know, can you do things more effectively? That's the first thing. And then the second is asking, what are you doing? There are only two questions you can ask. And are you doing the things that are in your strategy? Or are they doing things that are nice to have, and maybe when the rank order of things they shouldn't be done, or they should be done at smaller scale, or in bits, you know, bit by bit. So roughly the same choices, probably a different emphasis in business. Easier to get out of things than it is in government. But the first port of call always is, can you do things more efficiently?
John, do you think I could answer that question?
Sure.
On costs? Because when I took over as editor at the Financial Times, I went to several American friends to ask advice. And one of them was a man called Stan O'Neill, who ran Merrill Lynch. And the previous 2 years, he cut $4.5 billion of cost out of Merrill Lynch. And I said, how do I cut costs? And he said, Lionel, he said, don't bother with the perks. He said, the only way you're going to cut costs is you change structure. And he said, the second thing you have to do is you've got to get yourself an enforcer. He's got to be the lightning rod, or she's going to be the lightning rod. It's not you. And the third thing is the enforcer may not survive the process.
I think, if I may, and the point about structure is really important. So you look at this, again, federated structure that we have, and maybe therein lies a very interesting prize. The other quote, if I will, is I think it's about Lou Gerstner, who made a very big change at IBM. He changed it from a manufacturer of mainframes on its journey towards a consulting company. And his line about change is, he said, you know, we all talk on the platform, we talk a lot, we get on the train, and those who aren't in the train must stand in front of it. And then we start. And that was his view, rather frightening view, but that's America. You know.
Good. Well, last two questions. The gentleman there, and then Tony at the back.
Hi there. As someone who's been outside and come in, I think your points about failure and admitting it is really, really tough, as you were saying. And I don't know what the answer is, but you were giving a vision of, say, structural changes in the future. Have you, what's your vision on whether there's any changes in the culture of the civil service in the future, and how might you get there or handle some of these issues?
So I keep referring a lot in my remarks about behaviour and culture in that order, because actually that's the single most important thing. But it can't be made, it can't be changed in isolation. It's the product of strategy, the quality of leadership, the incentive structures, and actually the activities on the ground. And I think that's really quite important. You need a vision of them, but you can't sort of plug it in. I mean, you can demand values, but you can't change culture by demand. Culture comes as you set all the other things in the right order. And I think the biggest thing is, one of the biggest things, if you ask, I think, almost anybody about culture, they say, number one, being ability to perform, and number two, ability to continuously improve.
Last question in the back, Tony.
Thanks. Tony Halmos from the City of London Corporation. Can I just say how pleased we are to have supported tonight's event and indeed the whole series.
And indeed, I'm sorry I haven't mentioned you.
All right. They were mentioned before. My question is this. If you were invited to not this event, but a state school in Hackney, and there was 100 bright 16-year-olds in front of you, and you were telling them why they should think of a career in the civil service, what would you say to them? And what would you say to the senior people in Whitehall about what they should change, if anything, about how they attract bright 16-year-olds from state schools in Hackney into the civil service?
Well, I think I'd say what I say to people I want to get into any organisation. First, really think about what it is you want to do, but the most important thing is do something that makes a difference. And I think in the civil service you really can make a difference. You can make a big difference to people's lives and to the nation as a whole. Actually, you can do it pretty quickly in the civil service. It may take a bit longer elsewhere. So I'd say, if you'd like to do that, do that. And if you want to play football, just make sure you do it in the best possible way.
What about Whitehall? What should they do to be more attractive?
Well, I think I'd like to come back to this question of confidence. I think the civil service needs to get some of that old-fashioned confidence back. I think there's nothing more appealing than having people who say, this is what I'm doing, and I feel confident that I really am making a change, and you could be part of that team. And that confidence that they've got, first, time to talk to people, secondly, that they appear right at the top to be doing things in a pretty effortless way, and have a broad view of things, then I think they're very appealing leaders to come and follow.
Thank you very much, especially for that testimony in favour of effortless superiority. It's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for your questions and thank you for coming.